Neighbors had heard these sounds for years. Voices, clearly not those of adults, crying, and sometimes laughter. And all of it came from a property where officially only 2 adults lived. No one besides that couple should have been there, but the sounds didn't stop. And it went on for so long that it gradually became part of the background. Something familiar that was spoken of in hushed tones, but never taken seriously. And when the truth finally came to light, it turned out to be so monstrous that at first, people simply refused to believe it. But to understand how such a thing was even possible, one must first see the place. California, Contra Costa County, Walnut Avenue. This isn't the wilderness or a backwater in the middle of a desert, but an ordinary suburb about an hour's drive from San Francisco. Large lots, old oaks along the road, mailboxes on posts, an area where people traditionally keep to themselves, where it is customary not to meddle in others' business, where high fences are considered the norm, and unnecessary questions are seen as bad form. On one such lot stood an unremarkable grey, one-story house made of cinder blocks, a neglected lawn, an old van by the curb, a general sense of desolation. The owners, a young couple, had almost no contact with the neighbors. He occasionally went out to the mailbox. She practically never appeared on the street. They were known by sight, but not by name. And this, too, didn't particularly surprise anyone. Now, the lot stretched far back, much further than it seemed from the street, and the backyard was completely hidden behind a high wooden fence about 2 meters tall. What was happening there was impossible to see from the road, but the neighbors did notice a few things, and it was precisely these things they would later recall again and again. First, there were the sounds, voices, clearly not adults, laughter, sometimes crying. All of this came from behind the fence on the backyard side. Then some neighbors began to notice silhouettes. Short figures flickered between some structures, appearing and then immediately vanishing. One neighbor once peered through a gap in the fence and saw something that definitely shouldn't have been there. Tents, canvas awnings, some sheds, an entire camp right in the backyard of a residential house. And people. Not one, not two, several. Neighbors discussed this among themselves, at barbecues, over fences, in line at the post office. They said, "He's strange. That Garrido." They said, "It seems like someone is living there." They speculated. Perhaps relatives had come to visit. But it never went beyond talk. In 2006, one of the neighbors finally called the sheriff's office and reported that there were tents on the property, people were living in them, and something was clearly wrong. A sheriff's deputy arrived, knocked on the door, and spoke with the owner on the doorstep. He calmly explained that it was just storage for old things. The deputy nodded and left. He never looked behind the fence. And from that moment, another 3 years would pass before the world learned what was actually hidden behind that fence. On Monday, June 10, 1991, in the village of Myers, El Dorado County, something happened that would change one family's life forever. The place was located about 16 kilometers south of Lake Tahoe. Mountain air, pines, quiet streets. One of those areas where families come specifically for safety and tranquility. The Dugard family had moved here less than a year ago from Arcadia, a suburb of Los Angeles. A mother, a stepfather, and 2 daughters. The eldest was 11, the youngest only a year and a half. A new home, a new school, a new life, and everything seemed to be going well. The morning of that day began as usual. The mother left for work early. She worked as a typesetter at a printing house. Stepfather Carl Probyn stayed home with the youngest, and the eldest was getting ready for school on her own. She put on a pink windbreaker, pink leggings, and took her backpack. The school bus stop was just a few minutes' walk up the hill, and she walked this route every day. At that moment, Carl was in the garage, tinkering with some household chores. He saw his stepdaughter leave the house and walk up the street. An ordinary morning, an ordinary path, nothing unusual. And it was then that he noticed the car, a grey sedan, an old model, late 70s or thereabouts. The car slowly came down the street, turned around, and drove back, even slower. Carl thought then that perhaps someone was looking for an address or wanted to ask for directions. The car crawled past the garage and moved up the hill, toward where his stepdaughter had just gone. He kept watching. The car caught up to her at the top of the hill and stopped. A door opened, and someone, Carl couldn't make out the face, grabbed her and pulled her inside. The door slammed shut. The car sped off and disappeared around the corner. The whole thing took literally a few seconds, in broad daylight, on a quiet street in a mountain village, practically before the eyes of a witness. Carl chased the car on a bicycle, pedaling as hard as he could. But the grey sedan had already dissolved into traffic. At that hour, there were enough cars on the highway to get lost. He returned breathless, while a neighbor was already calling 911. Within minutes, the police were on the scene. Within an hour, the county sheriff arrived, and by evening, the FBI had joined. A description of those who did it was compiled immediately. A man at the wheel, a woman in the back seat. She was the one who pulled the victim into the car. The woman's age was about 30, dark hair tied in a ponytail. Vehicle description, an old model grey sedan. Description of the victim, 1 meter 35 tall, shoulder-length blonde hair, pink windbreaker, pink leggings. The search began immediately. Flyers, checkpoints, combing the area. Volunteers formed a line and walked through the forest. Helicopters circled over the mountains. But the grey sedan seemed to have vanished, along with everyone inside. The first 24 hours in such cases are the most critical, and every investigator knows this. The more time passes, the lower the chances, and the count literally goes by the hour. The El Dorado County Police were working at the limit of their capacity. The FBI joined the same day because such an incident involving a possible crossing of state lines automatically becomes a federal case. The description of the car and the suspects was sent to all posts in California and Nevada. Checkpoints were set up on highways 50 and 89, and a check of all grey sedans within a 100-mile radius began. The result? 0. In parallel, standard leads were pursued. They checked former acquaintances of the family, neighbors with criminal records, everyone who had come into view in recent months. They checked the biological father. It turned out he didn't even know of her existence until that day. They checked the mother's circle, the stepfather's circle, and again, nothing. They requested lists of registered offenders of the relevant category in the county. There were dozens of names. Each was interviewed. Each had their alibi checked, but no one fit the description. The kidnapping for ransom theory was dropped by the third day. No calls, no demands, and the family wasn't wealthy. Typical middle class, no millions. Federal agents expanded the search. They pulled databases for all similar cases in the western states over the last 10 years. A similar modus operandi a daytime incident from the street, a couple in a car, was quite rare, but a few cases were found. None of them led to Myers. On June 14th, 4 days after the disappearance, the case was featured on America's Most Wanted. Millions of viewers across the country. The hotline phone literally grew hot. Hundreds of calls, dozens of so-called leads. Each was checked, but none worked. The local community also got fully involved. Volunteers posted flyers from Tahoe to Sacramento. School friends of the missing girl wore T-shirts with her photo and organized fundraisers to print posters and a reward for information. Candlelight vigils were held every week. A month passed, then 2, then 6 months. The active phase of the search gradually wound down, not because they gave up, but because there were simply no more leads to pursue. All threads were broken. The grey sedan was never found. The suspects were never identified. And the missing 11-year-old student in the pink windbreaker seemed to have vanished into thin air. The case remained open. The federal agent who had worked on it from day one vowed not to drop the investigation. Flyers continued to hang at gas stations and in shops along Highway 50. Once a year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, local newspapers published her photo. But the chances of finding her alive diminished towards 0 with each passing year. And while the whole world considered her dead, 240 kilometers from Myers, in an ordinary suburb, in the house of a man whom the police already knew perfectly well, a completely different story was beginning. Phillip Garrido. By June of '91, he was 40 years old, married, living in his mother's house on Walnut Avenue in the suburbs of Antioch, working, at least on paper, at his own printing business cards, flyers, small-scale printing. This was the official version of his life. But there was another, and it began in 1976. Reno, Nevada, Garrido, then 25 years old, snatches a young woman right from a casino parking lot. He drags her into a car, takes her to a rented warehouse that he had pre-equipped with soundproofing, and keeps her there for several hours. Police find them through a tip. Someone noticed a suspicious van near the warehouse. Next came the trial and sentencing. 50 years in federal prison for the incident, plus a life sentence from the state of Nevada for what he did to the victim. 50 years plus life. It seemed like the end of the story. But Garrido served only 11. In 1988, he was released on parole. First from Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, then from a Nevada state prison. Documents showed exemplary behavior, participation in rehabilitation programs, and positive reviews from guards. The system decided he had been reformed. After his release, Garrido was transferred to supervision in California, in Contra Costa County. He moved in with his mother and married Nancy Bocanegra. They had met when she came to Leavenworth to visit her uncle, another inmate. The supervision conditions were standard for convicts of his category. A GPS ankle monitor that recorded every movement, regular visits from a parole officer, the obligation to check in personally, and a strict ban on any contact with persons under 18. And formally, Garrido fulfilled all these requirements. The monitor showed he was at home. The officer would come. Garrido would open the door, speak politely, and sign documents. Everything went strictly according to protocol. No violations, no alarm signals. In April 1993, 2 years after that morning in Myers, he did violate his parole conditions. Exactly what he did is not, and as it would later turn out, it was there, behind a high fence, in tents and makeshift structures, that a story had been unfolding for several years that no one could have even imagined. The backyard of the house on Walnut Avenue. It wasn't a yard in the usual sense of the word. It was nearly an acre of land, extending far beyond the property line, visible from the street. The neighbors had no idea how large it actually was. Garrido began outfitting it long before June of '91. First, he put up a high wooden fence around the entire perimeter, 2 meters, solid boards, no gaps. Then a second fence appeared, an internal one, even higher than the first. Between them remained a narrow passage overgrown with bushes. Next came the outbuildings, sheds, awnings, some booths made of plywood and canvas. From the street, all of this looked like an ordinary cluttered lot. Old things, trash, rusty barrels. Nothing suspicious for this area. Many lived like that here. But behind the second fence, something else entirely began. Tents stood there, several of different sizes, covered with blue tarps. Paths were worn between them. One of the structures was a soundproofed room about the size of a closet. The walls were lined from the inside, the window boarded up, and the door locked only from the outside. Inside lay a mattress, a bucket, and a bottle of water. It was there that Garrido brought the victim on the same day she was taken. Her head had been covered with a blanket while still in the car, so she didn't see the road, didn't see the house, didn't see anything at all. She only felt herself being led somewhere, then carried, then laid on something soft. The door closed and total darkness set in. The first days were spent in absolute isolation. Food once a day, no going out. Screaming was useless because the soundproofing worked. Garrido came and went, explaining the rules. If she obeyed, it would be easier. If she resisted, it would be worse. She was 11 years old at the time. Gradually, the regime became a bit softer. She was moved from that room into a tent. There was more space, there was a window, she could go out into the yard. But only within the confines of the camp, only behind the inner fence, and only when permitted. The shower consisted of a hose pulled from the house. The toilet was a bucket or a hole behind the tent. Food was brought from the main house, sometimes by Garrido himself, sometimes by his wife Nancy. Garrido's mother also lived in the house, but almost never left her room. She had dementia and Parkinson's disease. She barely understood what was happening around her. Whether she knew about the camp in the backyard is still unclear. But even if she did, she could no longer tell anyone about it. The neighbor's lot adjoined the fence closely, and one of the neighbors would later say that he sometimes heard strange sounds. He couldn't make them out, either a radio playing or voices. But he didn't peer over the fence. He decided it was none of his business. Thus, months passed, then years. An 11-year-old captive gradually turned into a teenager. The outside world continued to look for her. Flyers with her face still hung at gas stations along the highway. And all this time, she lived in a tent, 240 kilometers from her home, and a few meters from her neighbor's windows. 1994, 3 years of captivity. She was 14 at the time and was expecting her first baby. The birth took place right in the tent, without doctors, without a hospital, without any painkillers. Nancy helped. She was the only one besides Garrido himself who had access to the camp. What she knew about childbirth and how she managed is unknown. She certainly had no medical education. But the baby was born healthy. This was the eldest of the future daughters. After this, Garrido explained new rules. Now there were 2 of them. And if she tried to run, they would take both. If she told anyone, they would take her daughter and put her in prison for not leaving sooner. If she obeyed, everything would be fine because they were now a family. And this anchor worked better than any chain or lock. The captive received a new name, Alice. She was forbidden from saying her real name, and gradually she stopped using it herself. JC Dugard, the schoolgirl they were looking for all over California, remained only on the flyers. And in the tent behind the fence lived Alice. Daily life also changed. Some things appeared. Clothes, books, toys for the baby. Garrido sometimes brought gifts, explaining that he was taking care of his family. There was no television in the camp. The radio was only turned on occasionally, and news from the outside world almost never penetrated there. But something changed outside as well. In June 2002, 11 years after the incident, Contra Costa County firefighters responded to a call at the Walnut Avenue address. A young victim with a shoulder injury had fallen in a pool. Here, a question arises. What pool was on Garrido's lot? The parole officer knew nothing about it. And what young victim? Garrido's file listed no dependents, but the firefighters simply provided assistance and left. And the information was never passed to the supervision service. Life in the camp continued on its course. The first daughter grew up knowing no other life. Tents, tarps, a fence. That was her whole world. Mom was a young woman named Alice. Dad was the man who came from the big house. Grandma was a sick old woman who was sometimes visible in the window. What lay beyond the fence? She did not know and did not ask. Why was this fence needed at all? Garrido controlled absolutely everything. The daily routine, food, movement. He decided when they could go out into the yard and when they needed to sit quietly. Sometimes people came to the house, and then everyone hid, sitting in the tents without making a sound. This was called playing hide and seek. But with each year, hiding became harder because young ones, they make noise, they run, they laugh and cry, and their voices carry far. And the neighbors, living literally a few meters behind the fence, gradually began to hear something. The neighbors on Walnut Avenue were ordinary people, working, raising their families, minding their own business. The area there is quite specific. Large lots, sparsely placed houses, and unincorporated territory outside the city limits of Antioch. In such places, it is not customary to poke one's nose into other people's business. Privacy is valued here, and people tend to keep to themselves. But some things were simply impossible not to notice. First, there were the sounds. High voices, laughter, sometimes crying, and all of it came from the direction of Garrido's lot, where officially only 2 adults and a sick old woman lived. Some heard it in the mornings, some in the evenings. The sounds appeared and disappeared, but repeated with frightening regularity. Then the neighbors began to notice figures. One of them, who lived right against the fence, once peered through a gap and saw silhouettes, short, thin, fast. They flickered between the tents and immediately vanished. He didn't understand then what exactly he had seen. He decided he must have imagined it, but he hadn't imagined it. Over time, neighbors began to discuss this among themselves, at barbecues, at mailboxes, just during chance encounters. They said, "He's strange, that Garrido. Did you hear? There's something, someone there." And I saw. There are some tents standing there. They assumed that he might have let homeless people in or some relatives. They discussed it among themselves, but didn't call anywhere. Now, one of the neighbors knew that Garrido was on the registry, a registered offender of the corresponding category. This information is in the public domain. You can go to a special website and check any address. He checked, saw Garrido's photo, and saw his status. After that, he tried to stay away from that house and strictly forbade his family from approaching the fence. But he still didn't call the police. He decided it was none of his business. Year after year, the picture remained the same. Voices behind the fence, flickering figures, a strange neighbor with a strange backyard. Essentially, everyone knew everything, but everyone remained silent. In 2006, 15 years after the incident, one of the neighbors finally decided and dialed 911. He reported that something was clearly not right on Garrido's lot. Tents in the backyard, people living there, and there were definitely those under 18. He explicitly called the owner a psychopath with abnormalities. A sheriff's deputy arrived and knocked on the door. Garrido opened it, and a polite conversation took place on the doorstep that lasted about 30 minutes. Garrido calmly explained that it was just storage for old things. No one lived there. The deputy warned that if people were living on the lot without permission, it was a violation of the law. He received assurances that everything was in perfect order, wrote a report stating no violations found, and left. He never looked behind the fence. A few days later, life on Walnut Avenue returned to its usual rhythm. Neighbors continued to hear voices, continued to see figures, continued to discuss it all among themselves, and continued to remain silent. Another 3 years passed this way. Phillip Garrido was not just a former inmate. He was listed as a high-risk registered offender. Federal supervision, life registration, and a GPS ankle monitor. This meant the system knew exactly where he was at any given time. Coordinates were transmitted around the clock. If he left the permitted zone, a signal would trigger. If he removed the monitor, a signal would also trigger. Every movement of his was recorded and stored in a database. And the monitor worked perfectly. Every day it showed the same thing. Garrido was at home. 1554 Walnut Avenue. Inside the permitted perimeter. No violations. But the problem was that the monitor only tracked the coordinates of its owner. It did not see, and could not see, who else lived at those coordinates. In addition to the monitor, Garrido was required to receive regular visits from a parole officer, specifically a federal officer, as his first sentence was federal. The officer was supposed to check living conditions, ensure compliance with all restrictions, and monitor the ward's behavior. And the officers did come. Over 18 years, from 1991 to 2009, they visited Garrido's house more than 60 times. And that's not counting visits from local police, firefighters, medics, and other services. 60 visits in 18 years. And each time the procedure was absolutely identical. The officer would arrive and knock on the door. Garrido would open it, polite, calm, always ready to cooperate. They talked on the doorstep or in the entryway. Garrido answered questions and signed the necessary documents. The officer filled out a form, recorded the visit, and left. Not one of them, over all those years, went further than the entryway. Not one asked to see the whole house. Not one walked around the perimeter of the lot. Not one peered behind the fence in the backyard. Furthermore, according to the protocol, the officer had every right to inspect the entire dwelling. According to the protocol, he was supposed to verify the absence of persons under 18 in the home of a convict of his category. According to the protocol, any suspicious circumstances, for example, sounds indicating the presence of others, required additional verification. But the protocol is paper. In practice, the officer saw a calm man, a more or less tidy house, and the absence of any obvious violations. He checked the box on the form and drove to the next address. In 2008, just a year before the captives were freed, firefighters came to Garrido's lot several times. They were called because of his mother's medical problems. They were in the backyard, they saw the tents, they saw people there, but not one of them ever reported this to the supervision service. The system worked properly. Documents were filled out, the monitor transmitted coordinates, and visits were recorded in the database. And in the tents, literally, a few meters from those very officers, life continued, a life the system simply did not want to know about. 1997, 6 years of captivity. Alice, as she now called herself, had turned 17. Her first daughter was already 3, and she was again expecting her second baby. The birth went exactly like the first time. A tent, Nancy as the midwife. No medical help. A healthy younger daughter was born. And now 4 lived in the camp behind the fence, a mother and 2 daughters. Garrido himself gave the newborn a name. In fact, he gave names to everyone in this strange family. He also set the rules. He decided when they could go into the yard and when they had to sit quietly. In essence, he was the center of their small universe and the only window into the outside world. The daughters grew up knowing nothing else. For them, the tents were home. The canvas over their heads was a roof. The fence around the perimeter was the boundary of their entire known world. Mom was a young woman who was always there. Dad was the man from the big house who brought food and sometimes gifts. They did not go to school, did not visit doctors, did not play with others. They did not exist in any documents. No birth certificates, no medical records, no school records. For the state, these 2 figures had never even been born. Garrido taught them himself. At home, he taught them to read, write, and count in his own way, without any program or system. He told them about the world as he wanted to show it, and gradually he instilled his ideas about God, about fate, about his special mission. He sincerely believed that he was chosen, that he possessed the gift of hearing the voices of angels, and that he had to bring his message to the world. With the years, this obsession only intensified. Their mother, the one who had once been JC Dugard, was also changing. An 11-year-old captive had gradually turned into a young woman. By that time, she had spent more time in captivity than in freedom. Her connection to her former life grew weaker. Her mother's face, her stepfather's voice, the house in Myers, all of it became blurred, like an old faded photograph. She still remembered her real name and remembered being taken. But with each year, the boundary between what was before and what became after blurred ever more, especially when the daughters appeared, living, real, completely dependent on her. They became her main reality. The outside world continued to exist somewhere there, beyond the fence. Sometimes she heard sounds, cars on the street, neighbors' voices, dogs barking. Sometimes she saw helicopters in the sky. Sometimes, when Garrido turned on the radio, she learned some news, but that world did not come for her. The flyers with her face as it was on that day had by then yellowed and crumbled. The federal agent who had worked on her case from day one still checked every lead. But there were no more leads. Years passed. The eldest daughter grew tall, and the voices behind the fence became louder and louder. Autumn 2006. 15 years of captivity. One of the neighbors, who lived closest to Garrido's property, finally made a decision. He had looked the other way for too long and had convinced himself for too long that it was none of his business. But the voices he heard almost every day, high-pitched, clearly young, simply gave him no peace. And so he dialed 911. The police came and left, and nothing changed. The voices still came from behind the fence. Figures still flickered between the tents. He didn't call again. Because what was the point? He had done his part. He had reported it. He had warned them. After that, as it seemed to him, it was no longer his responsibility. And in the tents, literally a few meters from all these visitors, time continued to pass. By that point, the eldest daughter was 12 years old and the youngest was 9. Another 3 years passed like that. By 2009, 18 years had passed. The one who was once called JC Dugard turned 29. Her eldest daughter was 15, and the youngest was 11. Exactly the same age as she herself had been on the day she was taken. She had spent more time in captivity than in freedom. 18 years of her life there, behind the fence. During this time, 2 presidents had changed. The Berlin Wall had fallen. 9/11 had happened, and the world had changed almost completely. And she had lived in a tent all that time, in the same tent, in the same backyard. Her daughters knew no other life at all. They had never been to school, never seen a doctor, and never played with others their age. Their mother, the same woman who now responded only to the name Alice, had also changed significantly over the years. She was no longer that 11-year-old captive who was once dragged into a grey sedan. She had become an adult woman with 2 daughters, a woman who remembered her real name but had almost forgotten the voices of her family, a woman who had built some semblance of a normal life within this captivity because otherwise it was simply impossible to survive. By that time, Garrido had completely immersed himself in his religious fantasies. He sincerely believed that he had received a special gift from God, that he could control sound, and that he had to bring his message to the world. He printed leaflets about his so-called teachings, kept a blog on the internet, and called himself a prophet. And so, for the first time in 18 years, he began to take them off the property, first to stores, then just out onto the street. He handed out his leaflets to passers-by, and they stood nearby. 3 figures the world hadn't seen for so many years. A mother and 2 daughters, all 3 pale and thin, with a kind of empty gaze. All 3 remained silent while he spoke. By August 2009, Garrido decided to move to a new level. Simply handing out leaflets on the street seemed insufficient to him. He needed a real platform, an audience, a place where his message could be heard by many. And he chose the University of California, Berkeley. On August 24th, he arrived on campus, and both daughters, 15 and 11 years old, were with him. He wanted to get permission to hold a religious event, wanting to speak to students and bring his message to young minds. He went into the administration building and asked for a meeting with the person responsible for campus events. He was scheduled for the next day. And so, on August 25th, 2009, exactly 18 years and 2.5 months after that morning in Myers, Phillip Garrido walked into the office of the Special Events Manager at the University of California, Berkeley. Behind him walked 2 silent figures, the very ones the world had not seen since their birth, because for the world, they didn't exist at all. The manager he came to see was named Lisa Campbell, and it was she who would finally see what had gone unnoticed for 18 years. The conversation started quite normally. Garrido explained his idea, something about God, about voices, about some special gift. He said he wanted to speak to the students and bring his message to them. He asked for permission to use the venue. Lisa listened because it was standard procedure. Listen to the applicant, explain the rules, provide the necessary information. But gradually, she began to understand that something was wrong here. Garrido spoke strangely, constantly jumping from thought to thought, mentioning some angels who were supposedly communicating with him. Every minute, his speech sounded more and more incoherent. But the main thing that alerted her was the two figures next to him. They were silent, not uttering literally a single word throughout the entire meeting. They sat with their eyes downcast, tense and practically motionless. When Garrido addressed them, they flinched as if from a blow. Their faces were very pale, and their expressions were somehow empty, absent. Lisa had worked with people for many years, and during that time had seen all sorts of visitors. Strange, eccentric, difficult. But these two were completely different. Something in their posture, in their silence, in the way they looked at Garrido, caused her growing anxiety. She saw the meeting through to the end, as required. She gave Garrido the informational materials, explained the application procedure, and walked them to the exit. The door closed behind them. Lisa remained at her desk. The visitor had left. And formally, everything ended there. She could have calmly moved on to the next task. But she couldn't stop thinking about those two. Their eyes, their silence, the way they looked. Or rather, the way they barely moved. The way they looked at the man who called himself their father. All of this gave her no peace. A few minutes later, she got up from her desk and went to a colleague. She needed to tell someone about what she had just seen. She needed to hear from someone that it wasn't just paranoia. And that colleague's name was Allie Boyle, and she worked for the campus police. It was this conversation that would trigger the chain of events that would finally end 18 years of captivity. Lisa found Allie in the same building and told her everything about the strange man, about his speech, about some angels, about the application for a religious event, and most importantly, about the two silent figures who sat next to him throughout the meeting. Allie Boyle listened very carefully. She had been working for the campus police for 20 years. During that time, she had seen everything and had learned to distinguish ordinary eccentrics from real threats. And what Lisa was describing to her did not look like simple eccentricity at all. Two young people, strange behavior, obvious depression, fear in their eyes, a man who controls their every move. These were classic signs, and Allie knew them by heart. She made a decision immediately, without hesitation. Allie immediately contacted the Contra Costa County Supervision Service, found the inspector responsible for Garrido, and informed him of the visit. About the two teenagers and their strange behavior. The inspector's reaction truly surprised her. What daughters? He doesn't have any dependents. In Garrido's file, the very file that had been checked dozens of times over all those 18 years, there were no dependents, no persons under 18. According to the documents, he lived only with his wife and his sick mother. And that was it. Then an obvious question arose. Where did these two come from? The inspector handling Garrido's case was named Edward Santos Jr., and he immediately made a decision. Tomorrow, August 26, Garrido must appear in person at the Supervision Service office in Concord. And not alone, but with everyone who resides at his address. Everyone he calls members of his family, without any exceptions. The message was passed to Garrido that same day. And for the first time in 18 years, the system finally began to ask the right questions. Around noon, the office door opened. Garrido entered first, calm and polite as always. Behind him came his wife Nancy and 3 others, a young woman appearing to be about 30 and 2 teenage figures, the ones from Berkeley, 15 and 11 years old. The inspector began with questions. The young woman introduced herself as Alice and said she was just a family friend, living separately, and that the daughters were her own. Garrido confirmed this. Yes, just an acquaintance. He sometimes helps her, and he brought her here because he was asked. But the answers didn't form a complete picture. This Alice had no documents, no ID, no driver's license, nothing at all. She couldn't give her address and couldn't explain where she worked. When asked about the daughter's origins, she faltered and began to get confused in her testimony. Then Santos decided to separate them. He took everyone to different rooms and began to question each one individually. Garrido continued to insist on his version, just an acquaintance, nothing special. Nancy repeated the same thing, almost word for word, like a memorized text. Alice also held her ground and repeated her story. A family friend, lives separately, the daughters are hers. But something in her answers categorically didn't add up. She knew too many details about Garrido's house, knew the layout of the property, knew Garrido's mother's name, her illnesses, and even her habits. For a mere acquaintance, it was clearly too much information. The questioning continued for several hours straight. The inspector asked the same questions over and over, cross-checked the answers, and looked for contradictions. Alice was gradually getting tired. Her answers became shorter, and the pauses between them longer. And then, at some point, the inspector asked a question that broke the whole built-up structure. A question after which it was no longer possible to continue pretending. Santos already understood by then that this was no family acquaintance. But what alerted him most was her reaction. Every time the inspector asked a direct question, Alice looked toward the room where Garrido was, as if she were waiting for permission to answer, as if she were checking if he could hear her words. Santos knew perfectly well what that meant. The questioning had been going on for several hours by then. Garrido and Nancy sat in one room, Alice and her daughters in another. They were intentionally separated, so they could not coordinate their answers with each other. And then, the inspector went back to Alice. She looked completely exhausted. 18 years of silence is a habit that is very hard to break. But fatigue takes its toll. Defenses gradually weaken, and words begin to get mixed up. Then Santos decided to change tactics. He stopped applying pressure and spoke more softly. He started asking simple questions, not about Garrido, not about the house, not about who she really was. He just talked to her like a normal person. At some point, maybe from exhaustion, or maybe from the relief that she was no longer being pressured, she said something she shouldn't have said. And then the inspector asked his final question. Not, "Where did you come from?" Not, "Who brought you here?" He asked, "What is your real name?" A pause hung in the air, long and heavy, and then a voice was heard that the world had not heard for 18 years. the voice of that same 11-year-old who once left home and never made it to the school bus. My real name is Jaycee Dugard. The room seemed to freeze. Jaycee Dugard. This was a name from the list of the missing. A name from those same flyers that were posted all over California 18 years ago. A name that thousands of people had looked for. Police, FBI, volunteers, her own parents. And here she was, standing in an ordinary supervision service office, a 29-year-old woman with 2 daughters who looked 10 years older than her real age. Exhausted, pale, obviously terrified. But for the first time in 18 years, free. The inspector immediately contacted the FBI. The federal agent who had been working on the case since 1991 received the call within the hour. She had been found, alive. Garrido and his wife were detained immediately. They were taken to different rooms, read their rights, and handcuffed. By evening, both were taken to the county jail and held without bail. Jaycee and her daughters were handed over to social services, and doctors were called. This was the first medical examination of their entire lives. The daughters had never been to a doctor at all, had received no vaccinations, and had never undergone a single checkup. Jaycee's mother found out everything that same day. By then, she was living in Southern California, having moved there after her divorce from Jaycee's stepfather, and she had never fully recovered from the loss of her daughter. For 18 years, she had been waiting for exactly this call. She didn't know if her eldest daughter was even alive. Their meeting took place the next day. Mother and daughter, who were separated on that June morning in 1991, were finally standing together again. Jaycee remembered, maybe not everything, but the most important things. She remembered her mother's face, remembered their house in Myers, remembered the pink windbreaker she wore when she left that morning. She remembered her real name, even when Garrido forbade her from speaking it. The investigation into the Garrido case was launched immediately. Investigators entered the property on August 27th. A grey cinder block house, the same one neighbors had walked past for 18 years. Behind it, a high fence. Behind that fence, another one. And further back began that same camp that only Garrido, his wife, and the 3 captives saw. Investigators worked there for several days. They hauled away 3 trucks of trash and seized dozens of items that became physical evidence of the 18-year imprisonment. Then they began to study the supervision service documents and discovered a figure that both explained everything and explained nothing. 60 visits. Jaycee lived in the backyard all this time only because everyone who could have helped decided it was not their responsibility. In 2010, the state of California paid Jaycee $20 million in compensation for, to quote, numerous failures of the supervision system that contributed to her prolonged imprisonment. Garrido and his wife pleaded guilty in 2011. He was sentenced to 431 years in prison. She received 36 years to life. Jaycee wrote a book, reunited with her mother, and her daughters went to a real school for the first time in their lives. But the question this story asks remains unanswered. Just imagine. You hear strange sounds from a neighboring plot. You see something that shouldn't be there. You feel that something is clearly wrong. What will you do? If you like this story, subscribe to our channel and leave a comment. Until next time.